Hello and welcome to this week's, I was going to say, but actually it's this month's Inside the Lords. It's been so busy inside the Lords that I haven't had time to do a report back on what's going on. Obviously, we are in the middle of a huge furore around somebody from the Lords that everybody's talking about, and that's Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson, who has, over the years, been affectionately known as Mandy. That'll just show you how long he's been involved in politics, that you can say, what do you think about Mandy? And we all know exactly who we mean. It really has been a shocking set of revelations, though, in terms of the Epstein files, and finding out that Peter Mandelson is not just a kind of conniving, dark force of British politics, which, to be honest, everybody's known forever, but the fact that he's been a traitor, effectively. There's no other way of explaining it. He is now been revealed as having handed over very important economic insider information to somebody who he knew to be charged with and involved in the most sordid abuse of young women and effectively paedophilia and trafficking of women and so on and so forth, all of the things that you're familiar with. So you can imagine what it's like in the House of Lords. Everybody's got an opinion on it. Everyone's standing around chatting about it. And one thing I thought I'd just explain to you is that when I first arrived in the House of Lords, I think 5 years ago now, I actually had a sense of Peter Mandelson, who knows who I am, who's known who I am for some time, and he literally lurked near the Labour benches, and you really felt that he was one of the people who was directing what was happening to Labour in the opposition benches. People were actually quite fearful of him. He was a really Machiavellian presence in the House of Lords, and my experience of him was he'd glower at me. I think he said hello to me once, but I wasn't somebody that he was ever going to be talking to. But you really had this sense of him pulling strings, organising things, passing notes and so on. So it wasn't that he was an active member of the House of Lords who'd stand up and speak, but that he was always there behind the scenes. So I think that even though he's been disgraced twice previously and lost his job in politics, you always knew that he was capable of making a comeback, and obviously this time not. Well, it does raise very serious questions about the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer's judgment in terms of ensuring that he got one of the most prestigious jobs in politics, which was to be the ambassador to the United States representing the United Kingdom. And as everybody who I spoke to yesterday wanted to tell me, particularly Labour peers, which, they're not exactly friends with me, are they? Were coming up and saying, we always knew he was a rotten choice. We told Keir that he shouldn't do it. Everybody has a way of distancing themselves from what's happened. The only thing I want to reflect, and something rotten about politics has been exposed, something rotten about the establishment has been exposed when you see the sordid and way that deals are done in these horrible encounters that Epstein set up, and the way that he was obviously semi-blackmailing people, or who knows exactly what was going on, but creating this world of intrigue where the sense of entitlement, the sense of not being like ordinary mere mortals, which meant that you could behave so badly and never imagine that you'd get caught out. Obviously, we can associate that with the monarchy now and elements of the monarchy, but also now the leading political figures of our time. I think that is revealing, but I think what's also revealing is the calculating and pragmatic way that the Prime Minister of the country decided to just turn a blind eye. And although it is the case that no doubt Keir Starmer did not know the details of exactly what Mandelson was doing, Mandy was up to, nonetheless, nobody thought that this was a kind of good guy who didn't have some murky past, some relationships that really couldn't be justified. But do I think that's the basis on which Keir Starmer should be deposed as the Prime Minister? And in fact, I've been asked to do 2 media interviews saying, would I take the side of saying now it's time for Keir Starmer to go? I do not want this to be the basis on which Keir Starmer is deposed, either as the leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister, but also even just in terms of bringing the government down. Because I'll tell you why. The Labour government needs to be held to account and responsibility for the fact that they have managed to betray huge numbers of people beyond this sordid tale. I think that the treatment of everyone from the farmers to the hospitality industry to the fact that despite their promises that they're going to set up a grooming gangs inquiry, a national inquiry, actually, where's that gone? What's happened to that? And in fact, it's been left up to the MP Rupert Lowe to organise an alternative inquiry over the 10 days. And, you know, whatever I think about Rupert's politics, and he and I won't agree on many things, at least he's had the courage to organise something. This government has organised nothing. And so I do feel as though the betrayal goes much deeper than just this high-profile media, are obsessed with this story of Mandelson. And so I would much prefer, if you want, that we held the Labour government to account politically. And I hardly need mention to you that issues around immigration, issues around the fact that they're still talking about bringing in a form of Islamophobia definition that will have a serious attack on free speech, the fact that they will not deliver on the academic freedom, free speech part of the bill that we all passed to ensure that we can have free speech on campus. All of these things are what I want everyone to be talking about as scandalous and a treachery, rather than the particular malevolence of one individual, Mandy. Just on what's going on in Parliament as well, one of the other things which is a big intrigue is that we had a special gathering yesterday where we were given a briefing on the use of the Parliament Acts in relation to the assisted dying bill. Now, I do not anticipate that any of you will know what the Parliament Acts are, because neither did anyone else in the Lords, which was why it was packed, because we were all there for the briefing. And what's happened is that Lord Faulkner, Charlie Faulkner, has effectively, he and the supporters of this private members bill, the assisted dying bill, have basically put out press stories and media stories saying that the Lords are filibustering and holding up and are trying to block a bill that passed in the Commons. Actually, that's not true, but I've reflected on that before. They've therefore said that what they're going to do is to invoke the Parliament Acts. Now, I'm going to actually put this online for you, but I've got a nice little briefing here. Private members' bills and Parliament Acts. Constitutionally, I'm not going to try and explain exactly what this is, but just to say this, in order for anything to become a law in this country, it has to be passed by the Commons, but then it has to be passed by the House of Lords in some form. A bill can then be amended in a range of ways, but before it gets royal assent and actually becomes the law of the land, it needs to go through that process of the Commons, the Lords. Sometimes there's a ping pong between both houses. Generally speaking, the Commons wins out, but the bill might be amended in some way, etc., etc. Now, if there is a situation, very extreme situation, in which the two houses can't agree, no matter what, they just can't agree, you can invoke something called the Parliament Acts. That can be started at the Commons, which is effectively the Commons finding a way of ensuring that the Lords can't block something, or, starting again, as it were, and ensuring that the law is passed if that's the will of the elected House. And it's very, very rarely used. It has been used historically. It's all in this little pamphlet, so you can read it. But the thing that I want to emphasise is that this is very rarely, I don't think it's ever been used for a private members bill. It's about the elected House getting its way. And the truth of the matter is that private members bill, not in the manifesto, should not be treated like this. And there's no doubt about it that Lord Faulkner and his supporters have used the threat of the Parliament Acts and effectively creating a constitutional crisis in Parliament, because they can't win the arguments for a very flawed, badly drafted bill, this assisted dying bill, in the Lords, because, to be fair, members of the House of Lords, some of whom actually support in principle assisted dying, know that there's so many loopholes in the bill that we have before us that it really has to be amended to make it safe. Remember, this will be the NHS, the National Health Service, having to have a change to its constitution to facilitate medical doctors handing over lethal drugs to individuals to take their own life. That is a big change, a major change. It can't just be like rushed through. And so the Parliament Acts have been used in a way as a sword of Damocles, hanging over us. If you don't just nod this through, let it happen, then we're going to invoke this Parliament Acts. And it's one of the things which I most despise, by the way, about Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, far more than sending Peter Mandelson off to Washington, is the fact that he promised Esther Ranson, a celebrity, that he'd bring a bill forward. He then didn't have the courage to make it a government bill, facilitated it becoming a private member's bill, and then has, behind the scenes, effectively been encouraging the bill to take shape, even though it's a private member's bill, not meant to be supported by the government. And it's really, I think, being very, very damaging to the parliamentary process that has gone on behind the scenes. And I really wish there was more light shone on that. But it's also true that I want to reflect on the fact that I have real dilemmas myself when it comes to moral issues and matters of conscience. And the assisted dying bill is no doubt a bill of conscience. And that's why it's often a free vote, and nobody will interfere in even whatever political party. You're unlikely to be whipped, as it were, into voting one way or another, which is why both the Tories and the Labour Party, in fact, are split on these issues. But I myself, as a non-affiliated peer, also sometimes find myself in contradictory situations. So I'll post the speech, but I did a speech at last week's assisted dying bill committee debates, in which I argued against, and I argued very strongly against, face-to-face consultations that would mean that you could effectively organise the state to assist your dying without ever having had a face-to-face meeting with a doctor, never having seen a consultant, being videotaped as I am now, with the panel telling your wish that you want to end your own life and so on. And I argued that this was completely wrong, and it was very important that we retained as a presumption in most instances that there should be face-to-face consultations for anyone to become eligible or to be assessed as having passed the test for assisted dying. 1.5 weeks later, we have the Crime and Policing Bill, in which there is an amendment for changing, or there's a debate and a whole swathe of amendments which are objecting to clause 191 of the crime bill, which effectively passed in the House of Commons, which would allow the decriminalisation of no woman could be prosecuted or investigated or sent to prison for her own termination of pregnancy at any stage of gestation, which has created a whole panic, lots of headlines about the idea that this has meant legalising abortion up till birth. That's actually not what the bill says, and not what the amendment says. It's much more modest than that, and I explained that in the speech below. But what I wanted to note was that one of the controversies in this is something called the use of pills by post, telemedicine, whereby you can get effectively abortion pills in the post that you can use up until 10 weeks of your pregnancy. And I was arguing that this was a very positive thing, i.e. I was arguing it wasn't necessary for face-to-face. Now, that morally could be seen as contradictory. I don't think it is, because I think that a human life of a citizen with rights, adult, being facilitated, their death being facilitated in this state, is very different to the termination of pregnancy, a woman's right to control their reproductive their own reproduction, and also not be treated as though they're a breeding machine and so on. There's all sorts, though, of controversy around it, and you can just see that I've had to really work through that argument, really think about it. And I do think that it's important that we recognise that politics sometimes has big moral questions at the heart of it, and you won't all agree with me on what I've argued it here, but I hope that you can see that I've at least thought through and understand that that might appear to be contradictory. I don't think it is. By the way, in relation to that debate on abortion, I think that my side of the argument, i.e. the pro-choice side, the people who are arguing for women to have the right to abortion with less restriction and without criminalisation of individual women who may, for the most terrible circumstances, have ended up having a late abortion outside of the law. Even in those circumstances of being on the same side as people who are arguing that, I do not think that this should have been brought in straightforwardly as an amendment to the Crime and Policing Bill with barely 2 hours debate in the House of Commons. I don't think that was the way to do it. I think it's led to a public backlash. I think people suddenly start talking about abortion to birth. That's not what's been passed at all. I actually believe in the slogan as early as possible, as late as necessary. So I'm not saying I would, wouldn't be able to argue that morally. I'm simply saying that I think it was anti-democratic to try, in a way, to get that through as though it was nothing, and then to be shocked that there's a backlash. I also think that we should be having these kind of moral arguments in public. I don't think that Parliament or trying to kind of pass laws in this way is helpful, because I think we need to have public debates and discussions about big moral questions. And I hope that at the Academy of Ideas we've tried to do that. And we put out a Substack earlier in the week, which I can kind of link to, going through some of the debates we've had at the Battle of Ideas Festival over the years. I also wanted to refer to the fact that in the middle of this discussion on this particular amendment, also the old kitchen sink was thrown in by some fantastic speeches, by the way, on those people who are really worried about this clause 191 and the decriminalisation clause. But everyone was talking about all sorts of things, including sex selective abortion, sex selection, the idea that now if we pass this clause, that there's going to be everybody going to be indulging in sex selection. And I'd just like to point out that that seemed to me to be an irrelevant argument. However, it is an interesting argument, and therefore I want to refer to a Substack written by my colleague Emma Gilland, which is also attached. So you can see that that is an actually interesting issue that we should be thinking about, but actually has got very little to do with the amendment we were discussing. Okay, my final thought for the day, or for the month, is that we just finished last night, very late at night, the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill. It's finally gone through the Lords. I have to say that I wasn't able to engage in it as much as I would have liked, because I'm just one person and I can't split myself. There's so many pieces of legislation being pushed through at a rapid rate in the Lords, which I've whinged about before. But anyway, I'm glad that that bill is now sort of more or less over, and you can catch up with what's been passed, what hasn't been passed. It's very, very controversial. There's all sorts of real problems with the bill, but nonetheless, it's reached the end of its road. One thing I did speak about last night, and sort of stayed late to do so, was the fact that, and this is my final thoughts on the Labour government in a way, was just a very modest amendment saying to the government, will you please implement the guidance as statutory for schools about gender non-conforming children? What should teachers do? How do we ensure that social transitioning is not facilitated by teachers who are politicised, who use pronouns behind parents' backs, and so on and so forth? Now, this guidance has been written. There has been a consultation on that guidance that ended in 2024. The government have not said they're not going to issue the guidance, but they have not issued the guidance. It is a disgrace that they are leaving both teachers, pupils, female pupils in terms of changing rooms and toilets and so on, in a very difficult position in terms of not having the Supreme Court ruling enforced in schools, but also, as it happens, kids who are non-conforming, gender non-conforming, are going to get into a complete muddle, and half the time they're gender non-conforming because actually they've been exposed to a lot of this ideology via school, because they brought in third-party organisations who've told them they were born in the wrong body and so on and so forth. But regardless, the government have a responsibility to issue that guidance to schools, and they haven't, and they still refuse to. So I just made a short speech on that yesterday. And on that guidance, it's also the case that the Equality and Human Rights Commission's guidance, the code of that guidance, has also not been issued by the government, who keep saying we have to make sure that it's only 30 pages, right? We have to make sure that we have to think sensitively about what the implications will be. So this is all public bodies, NHS, universities, councils and so on, have not got that guidance on how to implement the Supreme Court ruling in terms of single-sex provision. It is ridiculous that the government is sitting on this and saying that it's too legally difficult, that they need to check it. I mean, they have people like Lord Hermer. What's his job if it's not the greatest position in law in the country, if not to check 30 pages of legal guidance? In other words, what I really want to indict this government for is cowardice. They will not act on unpopular decisions. They don't want to, they say they accept the Supreme Court, but they will not issue the guidance that is needed to ensure that public authorities, public bodies, actually conform to the Supreme Court's decision on single-sex provision. Why not? Because they don't want to upset the wrong people, because they're hedging their bets, they're fudging. So this is a government that U-turns with no principle on many things, but fudges and sits on guidance that it should be issuing to give clarity to the law. And I despise them for that. I despise them for that far more than what's happened with Peter Mandelson. In many ways, they are absolutely refusing to govern the country well, and therefore can't be held to account because they simply say, oh, we're just sorting it out behind the scenes. That is an act of cowardice that we should not let them get away with. See you next time.